This video is brought to you by Ground News. Welcome to another episode of Cold Fusion. Think of all the major bank frauds that you've heard of. From JP Morgan rigging precious metals markets, to Wells Fargo making up fake consumer accounts and scamming customers, to all of the banks involved in the reckless greed of 2008, a disaster that damaged the global economy. No justice is ever served, nobody goes to jail, and no one in power seems to care. But what if the opposite happened? What if white-collar criminals were served the ultimate punishment? This is the story of a woman who's just been sentenced to death in Vietnam. Trong My Lan didn't murder anyone. She didn't traffic drugs. She didn't commit treason. But what she did do was commit a fraud so enormous that it amounted to around 3% of the entire country's GDP.
In the past few minutes, a court in Vietnam has sentenced a wealthy property developer to death for defrauding a bank of billions of dollars. 67-year-old Trong My Lan was found guilty of embezzlement, bribing state officials and violating bank lending regulations after she used her hidden ownership of the Saigon Commercial Bank to channel $44 billion of loans to her own companies. It's been described as one of the greatest bank frauds in history.
And how, for over a decade, did this woman allegedly steal so much money without anyone taking her down? Get ready for a wild ride as we dive into one of the biggest fraud cases in history. This is bigger than Theranos or Sam Bankman-Fried, and it's a scandal that stained Asia's fastest growing economy.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Trong My Lan was born in 1956 in Saigon, South Vietnam, to a modest but entrepreneurial family. Her story really begins at the Ben Thanh Market, an iconic and bustling hub known for its intense bargaining culture. Lan learned how to hustle from an early age. As a teenager, she and her mother became a familiar sight at the market, selling cosmetics together. Detectives always look to a culprit's early life for clues about why they did what they later did. But with Lan, her early life doesn't give much away. There were no telltale signs that we know of, and nothing that would point to the criminal mastermind that she'd eventually become. Lan's negotiating skills must have really been something, because by the mid-1990s, she ventured into the property market and founded Van Thin Phat Group. Around this time, Vietnam was undergoing a transformation. Reforms had opened the doors for private businesses and families to compete, but land was officially under state control. So, getting access to it would require some serious charm in your arsenal to sway state officials. Trong My Lan's rise was as dramatic as her fall. In 1992, she met Eric Chu Napney, an investor from Hong Kong. They got married, had 2 daughters, and built an empire of restaurants, hotels, and properties across Vietnam and Hong Kong. And her wealth exploded. If we check out our typical profile of a white-collar criminal, this all fits the bill, with seemingly no reason to break the law. So that's why it's always so infuriating when they do. They get greedy, and as you'll see, they just want more and more and more. Around 2010 is when things start to go dodgy. Mrs. Lan was a major player in Vietnam's financial scene, and her company was one of Vietnam's richest real estate firms. She was powerful and had good standing with the community. Because of this, and presumably her connections, she was entrusted with arranging the merger of 3 struggling banks into the Saigon Commercial Bank, which we'll call SCB in this video. The plan was approved by Vietnam's central bank. Big mistake. From 2012, she began to siphon funds. She gave loans to herself and her friends and paid bribes to government officials to keep them quiet. And from here, her power would remain unchecked, for now. So aren't there supposed to be laws to stop this from happening? Well, there were. Vietnamese law clearly caps an individual's ownership in a bank at 5%, but somehow, over the years, she ended up owning 90% of the bank. So how on earth did she manage to own 90%? Step 1 in Lan's multi-billion-dollar bank fraud scheme: set up thousands of shell companies. She put the ownership of these companies and bank shares in other people's names, so a cursory glance from the outside would look like a healthy and diverse range of leaders and CEOs controlling the bank's subsidiaries and partners. But in reality, it was just her. Whoops. And then it became an inside job. Lan stacked the deck with her own people. She hired trusted associates as managers at SCB and instructed them to approve loans to her network of shell companies around the world. These companies often had no operations or employees. She would use fake contracts to move money out of the country. As the scheme grew, she needed more people to be in charge of her ever-growing list of fake companies. Her husband, her niece, and other family members got involved. 93% of the approved loans at SCB went straight into Trong My Lan's pocket. With this setup, Lan now had billions of dollars in customer deposits to play with. Imagine finding out that each time you deposit money, 93 cents out of every dollar disappears into one woman's personal piggy bank to do whatever they please. In the decade leading up to her arrest, Lan lent herself $44 billion in illegal loans. So how on earth does no one notice that much money missing? Well, it turns out that people did. Lan was a household name in Vietnam. Her position at Saigon Commercial Bank held her in great esteem. But her never-ending access to liquid capital meant that it was pretty obvious that she was up to something. Her shady dealings were an open secret, yet she passed audits from big names like Deloitte and KPMG with flying colours. Even if a regulator became suspicious and decided to dig deeper, Lan would hand out bribes like candy. Take the chief inspector of Vietnam's state bank, Do Thi Nan, who accepted a $5 million bribe. This was the largest bribe ever recorded in Vietnam, and it was delivered in styrofoam boxes. To put this bribe into context, top government officials in Vietnam earn around $1,000 per month. A $5 million bribe could set the inspector and her family up for life, but instead, life in jail is all she received. It gets even crazier. Over the course of 3 years, Lan instructed her driver to withdraw 108 trillion Vietnamese dong from the bank and store it in her basement. This was the equivalent of $4 billion US. Even if he withdrew all of that cash in Vietnam's largest banknote denomination, it would weigh 2 tons. Moving this kind of money without anyone noticing seems unlikely. But that's the thing. In a country when so many people are struggling to get by, a bribe to look the other way can be life-changing. That's why so many people accepted Lan's hush money and why she could get away with it for so long. However, her luck was about to run out and her empire was about to collapse. Vietnamese authorities were undertaking a scorched earth policy on corruption. The thing about Vietnam is that it's a one-party state, so there's not always an incentive or competition to keep those in power honest. However, since 2013, one of Vietnam's most powerful politicians, Nguyen Phu Trong, had been leading an anti-corruption campaign called Blazing Furnace. Trong realized that corruption within the Communist Party was actually a threat to their power, and in order to regain the trust of the Vietnamese people, they needed to create an image of a clean government. For years, the Blazing Furnace campaign focused on public sector corruption. In Vietnam, talk of cracking down on corruption wasn't new, and probably fell on a lot of deaf ears, including those of Mrs. Lan. So, while Lan was busy bribing and siphoning cash, the Communist Party began to take corruption in the private sector more seriously. As the US-China trade war raged on, companies scrambled to find new manufacturing locations. The Communist Party knew this, and through the Blazing Furnace campaign, they promised to make Vietnam a cleaner and safer place to do business. Foreign business investment poured in, and companies like Samsung, LG, and Apple pumped billions into high-tech manufacturing. The anti-corruption drive was paying off, and Vietnam became Apple's biggest manufacturing hub outside of China. But there was a flip side to this. Anyone found to be corrupt was going to be in hot water, and the more corrupt you were, the hotter the water. And Trong My Lan was the most corrupt of all. In October of 2022, Lan was arrested, and less than 2 years later, she was sentenced to death. It sounds wild, I know, but the reason for this punishment is both surprising and not so surprising. Hang tight, I'll explain in a bit. But for now, the initial fallout from Lan's arrest was huge. Police identified around 42,000 victims, bondholders and ordinary people who trusted SCB with their life savings. The court trial was televised and was a spectacle like the country had never seen. The 104 boxes of evidence presented in the trial weighed 6 tons. Lan's empire was so massive that it brought a once strong housing market to its knees. Property firms shut down in record numbers, and authorities seized over 1,000 of Lan's properties. High-rises across Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City now sit empty. Post-arrest, even Vietnam's central bank had to step in to prevent a financial meltdown. They pumped $24 billion in, quote, special loans into SCB to avoid a bank run. The government also turned to foreign investors to help stabilize the situation. Quote, without lending, SCB will collapse. If the lending continues, the national treasury will gradually dry up, end quote. Ironically, some analysts think that the arrest backfired and made foreign investment skittish right at the time when Vietnam was poised to be the next global manufacturing hub. In April of 2024, Trong My Lan was sentenced to death for embezzling $12.5 billion, and that's just the amount the authorities could prove. To put that into perspective, that's like someone in the United States stealing $763.2 billion. Lan's arrest shocked the nation, but the death penalty verdict even more so. Capital punishment in Vietnam is relatively common, but it's rarely applied in cases of financial crimes, especially with someone with no prior convictions. So what's the story behind the move? Well, there's a lot of perspectives. For one, Time magazine published, quote, Vietnam sought to make an example out of Lan, end quote. And this makes sense considering the verdict. Quote, the defendant's actions eroded people's trust in the leadership of the Communist Party and state, end quote. But the question is, was Lan's sentencing more about politics than the justice for her victims? Potentially. Some experts think that the Communist Party used her as a human sacrifice, just to show the world that they were taking corruption seriously. If Lan had just received a life sentence, the story probably wouldn't have made global headlines, and authorities wouldn't be able to push their narrative. Others speculate that the whole thing could just be a ruse, a method to terrify Lan into giving up more of her stolen assets and accomplices. They think that if she settles the outstanding debts of $28 billion, maybe she'll be spared. In the end, Lan pled not guilty and blamed her subordinates. She admitted that she was involved in the restructuring of the bank, but did not misappropriate its funds. She also told the court that by her getting into the banking industry without sufficient experience and, quote, a lack of understanding of legal matters got her into this situation. The courts didn't buy it, and all in all, 85 people were charged, including Lan's husband, who was sentenced to 9 years in prison, and Lan's niece, who was sentenced to 17 years. 2 former executives of the SCB Bank have fled the country and are still on the run. Before we continue, let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Apple has made headway towards its first unionized store in the US. It's interesting to see how this news is covered by different outlets, and that's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer. She was on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Using this Apple story as an example, we can see that 54 news outlets from around the world covered the story. Their biased distribution chart shows me the political leanings of those outlets, and I can get a summary of how the issue is being framed. The left tended to be more favourable to the union's perspective, emphasising workers' voices and future gains. Meanwhile, the right focused on the deeper historical significance of the agreement, referring to previous union activities and strikes. For other more politically charged stories, Ground News is helpful to get the full picture of different perspectives. Scrolling down, I can compare every single news article on the topic with convenient tags. These show me more context about the source, like how factual it is and who owns it. So Ground News is a fantastic tool for getting international views, sifting through misinformation, and identifying media bias. They provide you with all the tools you need to be a critical thinker. Today we're offering 40% off a Vantage subscription. This comes with a feature called My News Bias, so you can even check how your news viewing habits change over time. I also love their blind spot feed. This shows you stories that are underreported by one side of the political aisle. For example, if you are on the right, you probably missed the story about Elon Musk sharing a doctored video of Kamala Harris, potentially violating X's guidelines. Go to ground.news/coldfusion to get started. Thank you. Now back to the video.
To Vietnam, where a property tycoon has been sentenced to death in the country's biggest ever financial fraud case. 10% of a country's GDP, and nobody noticed. But you're saying she bribed people, but she must have bribed an awful lot of people for that to go either unnoticed or unchallenged.
I'm sure the officials knew about that, but they just pretended to look the other way because her main patron used to be a very powerful man. He was the party chief of Ho Chi Minh City and a member of the powerful Politburo of the Communist Party. So he was one of the top 15 or so leaders of the country. So he was so powerful, and he was ruling Ho Chi Minh City like his own fief.
The 2008 financial crisis showed us just how much we rely on banks to be run fairly. It revealed the devastating impact of unchecked greed on society. But this case was different. It made it very clear that even the very wealthy aren't immune from consequences. The bottom line here is this. Trong My Lan had every opportunity to stop. She was already wealthy before the scheme, but she didn't stop at $100 million, $1 billion, or even $10 billion. It seemed like no amount of money was ever enough, and she paid the ultimate price. But I'll leave the question up to you. Do you think that this is too harsh of a punishment? What counts as a fair consequence for stealing 3% of a country's GDP in fraud? That's something that we all have different takes on. And that is the story of how one lady scammed $44 billion. So thanks for watching. My name is Dagogo, and if you're new here, feel free to subscribe to Cold Fusion. Okay, so I'll see you again soon for the next episode. Cheers guys. Have a good one.